There is a side of witchcraft they never warned you about. Not the movies, not the rituals, not the symbols hidden in the dark. I am talking about the spiritual destruction that silently enters homes, families, minds, and destinies while people laugh it off as superstition. Why do some people pray for years and still feel chained? Why do certain attacks grow stronger after every breakthrough? Tonight, the darkest truth hidden behind witchcraft is about to be exposed, and once you hear it, you will never see the spiritual world the same way again. Most people think witchcraft is only about spells, candles, strange rituals done in darkness, but that is only the surface. The darkest truth nobody talks about is this. The real goal of witchcraft is not to scare you, it is to gain access to your life without you realizing it. That is why many victims never even know they are under spiritual attack. Because the attack does not always begin with terror. Sometimes it begins with comfort. Sometimes it begins with attraction. Sometimes it begins with an open door you thought was harmless. And this is where many people are destroyed. You were taught to fear dramatic manifestations, but the enemy prefers subtle entrances, a strange obsession, an unexplained heaviness, a sudden hatred between family members, continuous confusion, uncontrollable anger, endless failure at the edge of breakthrough. Little by little, something begins feeding on your peace, and people call it stress. But what if it is deeper than stress? What if the battle around you is spiritual? There are people watching this right now who know exactly what I am talking about. You pray, but your mind feels blocked. You sleep, but wake up exhausted. You try to move forward, but something invisible keeps pulling you backward. You fight battles nobody else can see. And the frightening part is this: witchcraft often works through agreement. That is the secret many never hear. Darkness looks for permission. Not always spoken permission. Sometimes emotional permission, behavioral permission, spiritual permission. Bitterness can become permission. Unforgiveness can become permission. Constant fear can become permission. Certain objects can become permission. Certain relationships can become permission for years. That is why some people unknowingly carry spiritual contamination for years. They think it is just bad luck. But something deeper attached itself to their atmosphere long ago. There are Occult members who confess that many attacks never started inside rituals. They started through access points created by people themselves. And once access is gained, destruction rarely happens instantly. It happens slowly. That is what makes it terrifying. A marriage begins collapsing without explanation. Children suddenly become rebellious. A peaceful person becomes full of rage. Finances disappear mysteriously. Repeated delays begin forming patterns. And people dismiss the signs because they do not understand spiritual warfare. Listen carefully. Not every hardship is witchcraft, but some attacks are too organized to ignore. Because darkness studies patterns. It watches weakness. It studies wounds. It looks for cycles. This is why unresolved trauma becomes dangerous spiritually. Some people carry childhood pain for decades. They smile publicly while bleeding internally. But hidden wounds become open doors. And witchcraft thrives where there is brokenness without healing. This is why spiritually strong people still sometimes collapse suddenly. Because strength on the outside means nothing if secret doors remain open inside. There are pastors who preach with power but secretly battle torment. Families that look perfect publicly but are spiritually shattered privately. People who shout, "I am blessed," while fighting invisible oppression every night. The darkest truth is that witchcraft often targets identity before destiny. Because once your identity is broken, your future becomes easier to control. That is why attacks often begin in the mind. Confusion, self-hatred, hopelessness, isolation, mental torment. The enemy wants you exhausted before you ever reach your purpose. And some people watching this have been under mental warfare for years. Negative thoughts that do not feel normal. Heavy emotions appearing suddenly. Fear without explanation. A strange sense of doom. You tried therapy. You tried distracting. You tried pretending. But deep inside you know this battle feels spiritual. And here is what makes witchcraft especially dangerous in this generation. People invite darkness while calling it entertainment. Certain music, certain rituals disguised as trends, certain spiritual practices promoted online, certain manifestations people celebrate without discernment. Many have opened spiritual doors through curiosity, because darkness rarely introduces itself honestly. It disguises itself as empowerment, as enlightenment, as freedom, self-discovery. But behind the mask is bondage. That is the part nobody warns people about. Some individuals entered occult practices searching for control over life. Instead, they lost peace, because darkness never gives without demanding something in return. Never. There are testimonies from former occult practitioners who admitted they could sense spiritually vulnerable people immediately. People carrying fear, people drowning in emotional pain, people disconnected from prayer, people consumed by desperation. Those conditions made attacks easier. And this is why spiritual discipline matters more than people realize. Prayer is not religion. Discernment is not paranoia. Guarding your atmosphere is not weakness, it is protection. Because the spiritual world is not neutral. Something is always fighting for influence. And one of the greatest lies ever told is that darkness is powerless. Number. Darkness is strategic. But here is the revelation many miss. Darkness only appears unstoppable when people remain spiritually asleep. The moment you become aware, the battle changes, because awareness breaks deception. And deception is the weapon witchcraft depends on most. That is why truth terrifies darkness. The enemy wants you distracted, spiritually numb, too entertained to discern danger, too wounded to fight back. But something happens when a person wakes up spiritually. Patterns become visible, manipulation becomes exposed, attacks become recognizable. Suddenly you understand why certain cycles kept repeating, why certain relationships drained your spirit, why certain environments felt spiritually heavy. And once discernment activates, bondage begins losing power. This is why the enemy fights so hard to keep people spiritually blind. Because a spiritually awakened person becomes dangerous. A praying person becomes dangerous. A discerning person becomes dangerous. A healed person becomes dangerous. And some of you listening right now are beginning to realize that the battles in your life were never random. Something was trying to weaken your faith, silence your voice, destroy your confidence, delay your destiny. But you survived. You are still here. And that alone is proof that darkness did not win. One of the darkest truths about witchcraft is this: it grows stronger where fear is allowed to rule. That is why many attacks are designed to intimidate you before they ever try to destroy you. Fear is the atmosphere darkness prefers. Fear weakens discernment. Fear clouds judgment. Fear drains spiritual strength. A terrified person stops fighting clearly. And once fear enters deeply enough, people begin surrendering without realizing it. This is why many spiritual attacks begin with confusion and intimidation instead of immediate destruction. Strange dreams, unexplainable heaviness, repeated setbacks, sudden emotional torment, a constant feeling that something is wrong. The goal is psychological exhaustion, because exhausted, people become vulnerable people. There are individuals watching this right now who feel constantly drained no matter how much they rest. You wake up tired. Your thoughts feel crowded. Your motivation disappears suddenly. You feel pressure you cannot explain. And the frightening part is that many people silently suffer these battles alone. They stay quiet because they fear being mocked. So they smile publicly while privately collapsing spiritually. That silence becomes dangerous. Isolation is one of the enemy's favorite weapons. Darkness wants you disconnected. Disconnected from prayer, disconnected from wise people, disconnected from truth, disconnected from spiritual covering. Because isolated people are easier to influence. This is why some attacks intensify when people withdraw emotionally from everyone around them. You stop answering calls, you stop praying consistently, you stop trusting people, you stop speaking about what you are facing, and slowly hopelessness begins growing. Many people think witchcraft only operates through rituals performed somewhere in secret. But one of its greatest operations happens inside the mind. The enemy wants your thoughts before anything else. Because if your mind becomes imprisoned, your life eventually follows. This is why negative thoughts can suddenly become relentless during spiritual warfare. Thoughts of failure, thoughts of worthlessness, thoughts of giving up, thoughts filled with dread and defeat. Some people even begin hearing internal accusations constantly. You will never escape this. Nothing will change. You are cursed. You are abandoned. Those thoughts become chains. And many people never realize they are fighting both emotional and spiritual warfare simultaneously. There are former occult practitioners who admitted that fear was one of the strongest spiritual weapons used against victims. Not because fear itself has magical power, but because fear weakens resistance. A fearful person becomes easier to manipulate. That is why intimidation is so common in spiritual attacks. Sudden nightmares, repeated symbols, disturbing atmospheres, unexplainable panic. The goal is to make you feel powerless. But hear this carefully. Fear is not discernment. Some people become so obsessed with darkness that they accidentally give it center stage in their lives. They begin seeing demons in everything. They become consumed by paranoia. They lose peace completely. That is not spiritual wisdom. Because obsession with darkness can become another trap. The enemy wants your attention trapped in terror instead of anchored in truth. And this is where many believers become spiritually unstable. They know attacks exist, but they forget authority exists too. Listen carefully. Darkness survives through exaggeration and deception. It wants you to believe you are defenseless, weak, abandoned. But spiritual authority changes everything, and that is the truth many people never fully understand. A spiritually awakened person does not fight from panic, they fight from authority. That changes the atmosphere completely. There are people who spent years terrified of spiritual attacks because nobody taught them how to stand spiritually. So every nightmare terrified them, every strange event shook them, every attack weakened them emotionally. But something changes when truth enters your spirit. You stop reacting emotionally to every attack. You stop surrendering mentally. You stop magnifying darkness above God. That is when fear begins losing its grip. And here is another hidden truth nobody talks about. Witchcraft often operates through cycles: repeated failure, repeated heartbreak, repeated destruction, repeated disappointment. Cycles are important spiritually because repeated defeat trains people to expect defeat. Once expectation changes, behavior changes. A person who expects failure stops trying boldly. A person who expects betrayal stops trusting people. A person who expects disappointment loses hope. And hopelessness is extremely dangerous spiritually, because hopeless people stop resisting. Some families battle the same destruction generation after generation: addiction, violence, poverty, broken relationships, premature death. People call it family patterns. But sometimes there are deeper spiritual roots sustaining those cycles. This is why discernment matters. You must learn to recognize patterns instead of dismissing everything as coincidence, with paranoia, not with fear, but with spiritual wisdom, because hidden battles cannot be confronted if they remain ignored. There are people who inherited atmospheres of chaos without understanding why their lives constantly feel spiritually heavy. Homes filled with anger, constant conflict, endless emotional torment, a strange absence of peace. And after years of living inside dysfunction, many begin normalizing bondage. That is another dangerous trap. When bondage becomes familiar, people stop fighting against it. They adapt to oppression instead of confronting it. But something powerful happens when a person finally says, enough, enough torment, enough fear, enough cycles, enough spiritual heaviness. That decision matters more than people realize, because resistance disrupts darkness. The enemy prefers passive victims, people who stay silent, people who stay broken, people who stay spiritually asleep. But resistance changes the atmosphere. Prayer changes the atmosphere. Truth changes the atmosphere. Faith changes the atmosphere. And some of you are beginning to understand why your spiritual life has been attacked so aggressively. Because your freedom threatens something, your healing threatens something, your breakthrough threatens something, your spiritual awakening threatens something. The enemy does not waste energy attacking empty destinies. The pressure around your life may actually reveal the value connected to your future. That is why some of the strongest attacks happen right before major breakthroughs. The enemy wants exhaustion before elevation. It wants you quitting before transformation happens. And this is exactly where many people surrender. Right before freedom, right before healing, right before restoration, right before clarity. But you must understand something tonight. Surviving the attack already proves that darkness failed to destroy you completely. You are wounded maybe, tired maybe, confused maybe, but still standing. And as long as you are still standing, the story is not over. Because spiritual warfare is not just about enduring attacks, it is about learning authority in the middle of them. One of the greatest deceptions about witchcraft is that people expect it to always look obvious. Dark clothing, strange rituals, visible evil. But the darkest forms of witchcraft often hide behind ordinary life. That is what makes them dangerous, because the enemy understands something terrifying. People rarely resist what they cannot recognize, so darkness adapts. It hides inside manipulation, control, seduction, hatred, jealousy, emotional domination. Many spiritual attacks do not begin in abandoned buildings or secret ceremonies. They begin inside relationships. This is why some people feel spiritually drained after certain conversations. You leave exhausted, confused, heavy emotionally, mentally unstable, and over time your confidence starts disappearing. Not every toxic relationship is witchcraft, but some. Relationships become spiritual gateways for oppression. Because people carry spiritual atmospheres. Some carry peace, some carry chaos, some carry darkness they do not even understand themselves. This is why discernment matters deeply. There are people who smile publicly while secretly operating through manipulation, intimidation, envy, and spiritual corruption. And one of the darkest truths nobody talks about is that witchcraft often feeds on control. The desire to dominate others, manipulate outcomes, to overpower another person's will. That spirit of control can appear in friendships, in relationships, in families, even inside religious environments. Some people do not want your freedom, they want your dependence. They want emotional control over your decisions, your confidence, your identity. And slowly, without noticing, victims begin losing themselves. This is how spiritual oppression sometimes spreads quietly, not through dramatic manifestations at first, but through gradual emotional destruction. There are individuals listening right now who have spent years around controlling people, every decision questioned, every dream mocked, every success attacked. You started shrinking emotionally to survive. You stopped speaking boldly. Stop trusting your instincts. Stop believing in your calling. And little by little, your spiritual fire weakened. That is not a small issue. Because prolonged emotional oppression affects people spiritually. The enemy understands exhaustion. If your spirit becomes worn down long enough, resistance becomes harder. This is why emotionally abusive environments are spiritually dangerous. Constant criticism, constant intimidation, constant fear. Those atmospheres slowly crush identity. And once identity weakens, spiritual authority weakens too. This is why many people under heavy oppression begin doubting themselves constantly. They second guess everything. They fear making decisions. They feel trapped emotionally. And the terrifying part is that some attacks become generational. Children raised inside chaos often inherit fear without understanding where it came from. A child watches constant rage in the home, constant manipulation, constant emotional violence. Years later, that same child battles anxiety, fear, instability, and self hatred. The cycle continues. This is why hidden darkness inside families is so destructive, because spiritual damage multiplies when left unhealed. And here is another truth many avoid discussing. Envy is spiritually dangerous. Some people smile at you publicly while secretly resenting your existence. They resent your progress, your favor, your gifts, your opportunities. And hidden envy can become spiritually toxic because bitterness changes people internally. There are people who became spiritually consumed simply because they could not celebrate others. Jealousy opened doors to hatred. Hatred opened doors to obsession. Obsession opened doors to darkness. This is why spiritually healthy people guard their hearts carefully, not just their actions, their hearts. Because darkness often begins internally before it manifests externally. Many people think witchcraft is only about external rituals, while ignoring internal corruption. But pride can corrupt, hatred can corrupt, unforgiveness can corrupt, bitterness can corrupt. A person can appear religious publicly while carrying deep spiritual darkness privately. That is why appearances mean nothing spiritually. Discernment looks deeper. And some of the most spiritually dangerous individuals hide behind charisma. They know how to speak well, how to appear trustworthy, how to attract people emotionally. But behind the image is manipulation. This is why spiritually mature people are easily deceived. They follow charisma instead of truth. And deception is one of the enemy's strongest weapons in this generation. False spirituality everywhere, counterfeit wisdom everywhere, performances without truth everywhere. People chase power while ignoring purity. That creates dangerous spiritual vulnerability, because power without truth eventually corrupts. This is why some people become obsessed with spiritual experiences while completely ignoring discernment and character. They want encounters, manifestations, mysteries, but they never confront pride, rebellion, unforgiveness, or hidden compromise inside themselves. That imbalance becomes dangerous because darkness loves counterfeit spirituality. Anything that replaces truth with deception becomes an open door. And many people never realize how vulnerable they became because the deception felt spiritual. That is the frightening part. Not everything spiritual is holy. Not every supernatural experience comes from light. Discernment matters now more than ever before, because we live in a generation addicted to influence but starving for truth. People follow trends spiritually instead of seeking wisdom, and that creates confusion. Some individuals opened spiritual doors simply through desperation for answers. They wanted healing, direction, success, love. But instead of seeking truth, they sought shortcuts. That is where danger begins, because darkness often offers shortcuts: instant power, instant revenge, instant control, instant success. But every shortcut carries a hidden price. Always. And many former occult practitioners admitted the same terrifying reality. What looked empowering at first eventually became tormenting. Peace disappeared, fear increased, paranoia increased, bondage deepened, because darkness never truly liberates people. It enslaves them gradually. That is why many people involved in hidden spiritual practices secretly battle torment behind closed doors. The public image looks powerful, but privately they are exhausted. Some cannot sleep peacefully, some battle overwhelming fear, some live with constant spiritual heaviness, because darkness consumes the very people who thought they controlled it. And this is why spiritual protection matters deeply. Not fear, not obsession. Protection, guarding your mind, guarding your atmosphere, guarding your relationships, guarding your spiritual life. Because what surrounds you eventually influences you. And some of you are realizing tonight that certain people, places, and environments have been affecting your spirit more than you understood. You felt weaker around them, more confused around them, more anxious around them. That discernment was not accidental. Your spirit was recognizing what your eyes could not fully explain. And now your eyes are opening. You are beginning to understand why peace disappeared in certain atmospheres, why confusion intensified around certain individuals, why your spiritual strength weakened in certain seasons. Not every battle was physical. Some battles were deeply spiritual from the beginning. The greatest fear of darkness is not religious activity, it is spiritual awakening. Because once a person truly wakes up spiritually, manipulation begins losing power. This is the truth many never understand until after years of bondage. Darkness survives where people remain unconscious spiritually, unaware of patterns, unaware of deception, unaware of authority. That is why so many attacks are built around distraction, constant noise, constant entertainment, constant emotional chaos. Anything to keep people disconnected from discernment. Because a distracted mind becomes spiritually vulnerable. And many people today are spiritually exhausted not because they lack strength, but because they are constantly surrounded by confusion. Their minds never rest, their emotions never settle, their spirit never becomes still enough to discern clearly. This creates dangerous vulnerability because confusion weakens resistance. That is why one of the enemy's greatest strategies is to keep people emotionally unstable. Constant anger, constant anxiety, constant offense, constant fear. A person trapped in emotional chaos struggles to hear clearly spiritually. And this is exactly where many destinies become delayed. Not destroyed immediately, delayed. Years lost in confusion, years lost in toxic cycles, years lost battling invisible heaviness without understanding the real war happening underneath. There are people listening right now who suddenly realize their greatest battle was never physical circumstances alone. The real battle was for your focus, your faith, your identity, your spiritual clarity. Because once those things weaken, everything else becomes easier to attack. That is why darkness fights prayer so aggressively. Have you ever noticed how distractions suddenly increase the moment you try to pray seriously? Fatigue appears, restlessness appears, your mind becomes crowded suddenly. Because prayer disrupts spiritual interference. Prayer realigns the atmosphere. Prayer sharpens discernment. Prayer strengthens spiritual authority. And darkness hates spiritually disciplined people, not loud people, disciplined people. People who remain spiritually alert. People who guard their minds carefully. People who refuse to surrender emotionally. Those people become dangerous spiritually because consistency breaks cycles. And some of you have survived attacks specifically designed to make you quit spiritually. You were supposed to become bitter, supposed to lose faith, supposed to stay broken, but somehow you kept fighting. Even wounded, kept praying. Even confused, you kept searching for truth. Even exhausted, you refused to completely surrender. That matters more than you realize, because survival itself became evidence that darkness failed to finish its assignment against your life. There are attacks that should have destroyed you emotionally years ago, but you survived. Moments when you almost gave up completely. Moments when fear nearly consumed you. Moments when isolation nearly broke you mentally. Yet you are still here, listening to this message. That is not accidental. Something inside you refused to die. And this is the revelation many people miss. Spiritual warfare often intensifies around people carrying strong purpose. The enemy attacks potential aggressively because purpose threatens darkness. A healed person threatens darkness. A free person threatens darkness. A spiritually awakened person threatens darkness. That is why some individuals face unusual resistance throughout life, repeated opposition, repeated delays, repeated battles. The pressure was not proof you were abandoned. It was proof your future carried weight. And many people spend years interpreting warfare incorrectly. They think struggle means failure. They think attacks mean weakness. They think pressure means defeat. Number. Sometimes warfare reveals importance. Because darkness does not waste effort attacking empty destinies. And this is why the enemy tries to convince people they are powerless. Powerless people stop resisting. Powerless people stop praying. Powerless people surrender mentally. But the greatest turning point in spiritual warfare happens when a person remembers authority, not arrogance. Authority, there is a difference. Authority understands truth. Authority understands identity. Authority understands spiritual position. And once identity becomes clear, fear begins collapsing. This is why spiritually mature people do not panic easily during warfare. They recognize attacks without surrendering emotionally to them. That maturity matters deeply because panic amplifies confusion. Fear amplifies torment. Hopelessness amplifies vulnerability. But faith stabilizes the mind. And stability is powerful spiritually. Some people think spiritual warfare means dramatic reactions constantly. But often the strongest spiritual response is disciplined peace in the middle of chaos. Refusing fear, refusing despair, refusing spiritual intimidation. That resistance weakens darkness more than people realize. And here is another truth nobody talks about enough. Healing is spiritual warfare too. Healing from trauma, healing from bitterness, healing from emotional wounds. Those things matter spiritually because wounded people remain vulnerable to cycles. The enemy loves unhealed pain because pain influences decisions, pain influences relationships, pain influences identity. But healed people become harder to control. That is why your healing matters so much, not just physically, internally. Some of you have carried wounds for years while pretending to be strong publicly. But hidden pain creates hidden weakness, and darkness studies weakness carefully. This is why healing must replace pretending. Freedom begins where honesty begins. The moment you stop denying the battle, recovery begins. The moment you confront the pain, restoration begins. The moment you reject fear, spiritual clarity begins returning. And many of you are entering that moment right now. Your eyes are opening spiritually. You are recognizing patterns that once confused you, recognizing environments that weakened you, recognizing relationships that drained your spirit. Discernment is increasing. And once discernment increases, bondage starts breaking, because deception cannot survive where truth becomes visible. That is why darkness fears spiritually awakened people more than anything else. Not perfect people, awakened people, people who can recognize manipulation, people who refuse intimidation, people who understand authority, people who refuse to surrender their minds to fear. Those people become extremely difficult to enslave spiritually. And maybe that is why you survived every attack that tried to bury you. Maybe the pressure did not come to destroy you completely. Maybe it came to awaken you. Tonight your eyes have been opened, and darkness loses power when truth is revealed. You are not helpless, you are not abandoned, and you are not destined to remain trapped in cycles of fear and oppression. Every chain fighting your mind, your peace, and your destiny can be broken when spiritual authority rises inside you. This is the hour to reject fear, reject deception, and stand awake spiritually like never before. The battle may have been violent, but you survived it for a reason. And after everything sent against you, one truth still remains. Darkness could not destroy what God decided to preserve.